Tzedakah. Bring your redemption. Keep you safe. Make the world a better place. Should make like a catchphrase, a bumper sticker. Okay. We are in Siman Tavku Pei Vav, chapter 586, which is the laws of the Shofar of Rosh Hashanah. We're going to go through a few things tonight. We'll see where we go. First, one of my favorite laws. Yeah, as I mentioned last night. This is chapter 586, law number 6. HaTokeya b'shofar shel avodah zara shel Yisrael. One who blows a shofar on Rosh Hashanah. It's an idolized shofar of a Jew. Meaning, in other words, a Jew did an act of idol worship, bowed down or the like, to a shofar and accepted upon himself as a god. God forbid. Why specifically a Jew? Why not a non-Jew? We're not going to get into that right now. But this is the case. And somebody took the shofar and blew it on Rosh Hashanah. The example the Alter Rebbe gives for what kind of, for example, he bowed down to a shofar. Loi yatsa, a Jew who blows this shofar on Rosh Hashanah to fulfill the mitzvah, has not fulfilled the mitzvah. Now, that's not the exciting part. I mean, the more you look into it, the more exciting it gets. But the reasoning given is very interesting. Why? Mishum de shofar tzarich sheyehei b'tefach k'moi sheyizbar. In the Shulchan Aruch, the Alter Rebbe is going to explain in a few paragraphs from now that the minimum size for a shofar, there's a minimum size. It can't be any size. It can't be this long. The minimum size for a shofar is the size of a tefach. Tefach is a fist, a handbreadth. Okay, that's the minimum size for a shofar. If it's smaller than that, it's not a shofar. It's not valid. You can't use it on Rosh Hashanah for blowing shofar to do a mitzvah. Okay, so what's the reasoning? You haven't fulfilled your obligation because a shofar needs to have a handbreadth, the size of a handbreadth. V'zeh shu oimid lisarif. This shofar needs to be burnt. This shofar that was bowed down to as an idol, it needs to be burnt. According to Jewish law, an idol must be burnt. Now, 1 second. Usually, there's an option that you can be mevatel. You can nullify the idol worship. The person who worshipped it says, "I no longer accept upon myself that this is a god. This is not a god. I made a mistake." Whatever the wording is. But there's the idea of nullifying the idol worship. And that's obviously a preferred option than to burn something that. So the Alter Rebbe says, why does it need to be burned? It's explained elsewhere in the Code of Jewish Law in the Shulchan Aruch that an avodah zara, idol worship of a Jew, God forbid, even if a non-Jew were to come and say that this idol is no longer an idol, like whatever, this fake god is no longer, we realize it's a fake god, we made a mistake. Even then, it has not become nullified. It's still considered an idol-worshipped item. Therefore, the only other option is v'tzarich l'seif, it needs to be burnt. Okay. Now, there's a rule in Jewish law. Anything that is required to be burnt and needs to be burnt, and is basically the way we look at it that it is already burnt. An interesting way to look at it. This thing that is required it needs to be burnt. We look at it as if it is already burnt, and I guess it's just like an obstacle of it didn't happen yet, right? So, being that it needs to be burnt, and it's looked at as if it is already burnt, an already burnt shofar does not have the size of a handbreadth. It doesn't have the sheer. It doesn't have the size of a handbreadth. It's ashes. Ashes don't have any size and no length to it. Right? So since it's supposed to be burnt, it has to be burnt, and it's therefore looked at as if it's already burnt. And if it's already burnt, it doesn't have the size of a handbreadth. Automatically, if you blew a shofar that doesn't have the size of a handbreadth on Rosh Hashanah, you have not fulfilled your obligation. Okay. Now, the next number of laws are actually unavailable in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. There's chunks of the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch that we don't have, large chunks. They were burnt. They were whatever happened to them. There's a story behind them. This is one such section. Within this chapter, there's a chunk of it missing. So it's the laws of dealing with the beginning of the laws of a cracked shofar that is cracked. And we have some of the laws that are related to a cracked shofar. We're going to skip over those. I want to go to something else. Where is it? I'll give you an overview of what it says over here. No, we'll read it inside. Why not? Law number 16. There can't be any obstacle or interruption between the mouth of the one who's blowing shofar and the shofar itself. Lefichach, therefore. Im hatzipohu zahav b'mkayim anachas hapeh kedei l'na'osoi afilu metzipohu ba'erech hashofar im hu miyad somuch l'roishe b'tzad ha'kotz or posel. Lefi shahatekeya machnis k'sosi b'fiv v'sosi mechasa lo v'nimtza hazav chaytis bein tzvasa l'shofar aval im hatzipohu hirachik mipiyat tekeya kosher. Let's say you want to coat your shofar with gold. You want your shofar to look really, really special. So you decide you want to cover it in gold. There is an additional thing to consider when covering in gold. We'll see it in a second. But let's say it's fine to cover it in gold. If the gold goes all the way till the edge where you put your mouth there, in other words, between your mouth and the shofar, there's a layer of gold, this is not valid. It's not a valid shofar because there can't be anything between the mouth of the blower and the shofar itself. In this case, there's a layer of gold. So what if you say, okay, I'll coat the shofar with gold. Let's say this pushka. Maybe a pen would be better. Let's say this pen is the end of the shofar, yeah? Here's the word the blower puts his mouth. Here's the bigger end, okay? I'm going to coat it with gold, I don't know, till about here, let's say, almost till the end. That way, when I blow the shofar, my mouth won't have anything between it and the shofar. Now, if anybody who's ever had practical experience blowing a shofar will know that this won't work. Why? Because when you blow shofar, you have to put the shofar past your lips a little bit. That's just the nature of blowing shofar. I'm sure those who blow trumpet and trombones and all these such instruments, they have a similar story. You have to actually insert it into the mouth slightly. It has to go past the lips slightly. You can't blow it while it's sitting on top of your lips. It just doesn't really work. That being the case, when you put your shofar into your lips a little bit, it actually does go and it covers over the gold part. And you're having the same problem. The only way that this can work is if the gold ends over here. In other words, that when you put your mouth on the shofar is slightly into your mouth, it will not make what I'm looking for. An interruption, so that's not the right word. A barrier. Hefsek, looking for an English word. There's not a barrier between your mouth and the shofar. Now, that's regarding to a barrier. But there's also an additional thing to consider, a problematic consideration regarding the sound. Continues the Alter Rebbe. What are we talking about here? When there's a discussion about whether the gold is by the mouthpiece or not by the mouthpiece, it covers, doesn't cover, this is all when the sound of the shofar does not change because of the gold layer. Or you're not sure, you don't know if it changed, you're not aware that it changed, and you can assume that presumably it did not change because of a very thin layer of gold. But if you know for a fact that the shofar, the way it sounded before you coated it with gold, and the way it sounds after you coated it with gold are two different sounds. Even if the change is ever so slight change, but there is a change, puzzle, this shofar is no longer valid. Forget the mouthpiece for a second. This is said elsewhere in the Shulchan Aruch that the sound of the shofar that you need to hear on Rosh Hashanah, the Torah tells us it needs to be just the sound of the shofar, not the sound of a shofar and the sound of something else as well. In this case, you're having the sound of the shofar, and because there is a change, you're also hearing a sound that is contributed due to the gold layer. Okay. And then the next law of the Alter Rebbe talks about adding a gold extension to the end of the other end of the shofar. We're not getting to that now. One last thing, which is I haven't seen it personally, but I'm sure it exists, so might as well say it. Talk about it. One last thing. Law number 18. What if you paint pictures on your shofar? You want your shofar to look really nice. Forget you say gold is an issue. Let me try paint. I want to draw nice pictures of apples and honey and whatnot, different fancy words. Those who draw pictures on their shofar, they are not doing a correct thing. He's not saying it's invalid, but they're not doing something that's correct. Why? Although the entire thing is not covered in pictures, it's not coded in pictures. Sometimes the sound of the shofar does change from drawing pictures on it. However, but you're allowed to etch, engrave pictures or words, whatever, forms into the shofar, as long as you don't go all the way through and make a hole. That's a different discussion. That's earlier in this chapter, actually. Without making a hole, you're just etching, you're engraving things onto the shofar to make it beautiful. Here, if you engraved pictures onto the shofar is still kosher, even if the sound changes. Why? Because when you're drawing a picture on the shofar, you're adding something. Then it can contribute to changing the sound. It's something else that's not shofar. When you engrave, it's talked about this in Chassidus actually, the difference between writing and engraving. But when you engrave, you didn't add anything to the shofar. On the contrary, you took away from the shofar a little bit. But it's still the same shofar. Nothing was added to it. So even if the sound changes, it's still the same shofar making a sound. Okay, the sound changes, but the sound being changed is not due to adding something else to the shofar, and that's causing a change in sound. It's the shofar itself. It's all the shofar itself. And as we learned in law number 9, we didn't learn it, but it says it here, that all sounds of a shofar are kosher. So even if somebody blows a shofar and it sounds like a dying horse, they're blowing the shofar and they're blowing correctly, it's still kosher sound. You fulfill the mitzvah if it's done properly. If it's done properly, I add, because it explains in chapter 590, if I'm not mistaken, which is 590, which talks about how you're supposed to blow the shofar. It needs to be done correctly, and it's very difficult to do correctly. And if it's not done correctly, you have not fulfilled your obligation. So make sure, Rosh Hashanah, when you go to hear shofar, you're going to a reliable shofar blower who knows the laws well and knows what he's doing and knows what to do if a mistake occurs, which is all discussed. Okay. We will continue, God willing, tomorrow. Have a good night.